Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Hello and welcome to the Power Trends podcast. I am Kevin Lanahan, Vice President, External Affairs, Corporate Communications. This is episode 37, and we are hosting Aaron Markham, who is the Vice President of Operations. Aaron is going to walk us through the 2024-2025 winter assessment and preparedness. We've had Aaron on the podcast before, talking about some operations issues, and we look forward to speaking with him today. Aaron, welcome.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate you having me, and looking forward to discussing winter preparedness.
When you do the winter preparedness report, where are you pulling the data from, and what's the team really focused on in that process?
So winter preparedness is really a year-round event in operations. The official assessment of the data starts in August. We really look at what we expect to be available from a resource perspective, so from a generator perspective, from a special case resource perspective, as well as what we expect to be able to get into the market from an external area perspective, external capacity. That coupled with what we expect to be unavailable. So generators typically have forced outages. It's just part of the nature of things. Things break. Usually the best information on that comes from historic performance data of the resources. So we look at that quite in detail. And we also, from a winter perspective, look at the fuel availability situation of generators, because that's really key, especially as many of the generators in New York are natural gas fired, and the natural gas system is primarily built to serve the firm customer demand, which is the heating load primarily, and that's higher in the winter, which results in less gas being available for electric gen.
So you're looking at the amount of megawatts you can expect to be on the system. You're talking to those generators to understand what they're doing to maintain their facilities to get ready for winter, so you have some reasonable confidence that they're going to show up when you need them. You're considering the age of these facilities because they're getting older, and we're not building new right now, at least new gas-fired generation. And then you're thinking about, you talk about firm demand. Maybe we can explain what that is, and then if you can also unpack for folks special case resources.
The special case resources are a class of resources that are a bit unique. They are actually loads or demand on the system primarily, typically large industrial customers that have committed to reduce demand in times of need or when we call upon them, which ultimately makes them look like a supply resource in our market because we can actually reduce the amount of electricity that they're consuming in times of need.
And so that helps out when demand is high and control room operators are seeing how the system's responding, and then we'll call up those industrial customers and say, it's game on. You agreed to reduce your demand at this point, and we need you to do that.
Correct.
Okay. We talked about the age of the resources. Let's just focus on that for a minute and how that factors into your calculations, whether it's summer or winter looking forward.
Typically what we do when we assess either the summer or the winter capacity going into the season is look at an average forced outage rate of the resources. In technical terms, that's E4D, which is essentially the ability of a resource to be available when it's needed. So each resource class and each resource specifically has different forced outage rate, and it can be based on many things, one of which, as you alluded to, Kevin, is the age of the unit. So even with a lot of maintenance that is occurring at the units to keep them in prime condition, as a resource ages, it's more likely to break. I mean, if you think of your car, just, the older it is, even if you're doing the oil changes and the tire maintenance and the replacing the brakes, as components age and get older, they are more likely to break, which is no different in the generating fleet. So we essentially look at that average forced outage rate over the last couple of seasons, and that is our starting point for what we think is going to be unavailable. Now, if we have specific information that an additional generator has suffered a forced outage and its repair plan is going to take longer to accomplish than the season, we consider that as unavailable as well.
Let's begin to unpack what you found with this assessment. So we will have sufficient winter capacity for this upcoming season. But there are some things that jump out at you with this data that give you some pause and some concern.
We really do a number of different scenarios that try to encompass what we would expect the winter to look like. We look at 3 different load levels: baseline forecast, which is essentially our forecast that has about a 50% probability of occurring for the winter. Then we look at 2 more extreme forecasts. One is a 90-10 forecast, or a forecast that has about a 10% probability of occurring, and then a 99-1, or a forecast that has about a 1% probability of occurring. The colder it is, the more electric demand there is on the system. So each of those scenarios is representing or looking at a colder ambient condition really across the state, which would drive those demands higher.
Weather is a huge component here, and you're running several scenarios based on several different outcomes of weather that could arise. And you're also looking at not just the ambient temperature, but how long that ambient temperature might occur.
Correct. In the winter, load is primarily a function of how cold it is. So the longer it's cold, the more energy is used for space heating, for other things. The higher the demand that we have to serve is going to be. The other thing that we really look at in the winter is the available fuel to run the electric generators. So typically in the winter, the most likely scenarios that we look at are, under those colder conditions, the limited availability of natural gas to serve power generators. So we call that our firm fuel scenario, really looking at units that have either firm contracts to get natural gas off the gas system, or in New York, we have a very large fleet of dual fuel units, which means they can burn natural gas when it's available and economic, but they also have the ability to burn liquid fuel. And typically they have fairly large storage tanks on site to store that fuel, so that in times of the unavailability of natural gas, or when natural gas becomes uneconomic, i.e. the price of it is higher than the price of oil, they can switch fuels and still provide electric service at the most economic rate.
Really helpful element when it's really cold, especially for extended periods of time. But most of those assets are in New York City.
Correct. A lot of them are downstate, which helps because they are closer to the fuel terminals. They're typically able to be resupplied with oil using the waterways. Barges and ships can carry a lot more fuel and are a lot easier to resupply the quantities of fuel that are needed to produce electric generation. Whereas if you think of a truck running over a road, it would take a lot of trucks to resupply a power plant, especially in the winter when the roads may be snow-covered or icy, which would slow down those deliveries.
So we said, based on this assessment, you're confident there's sufficient winter capacity margins going into this season, but that there's some things that do give you pause or concern, and you've covered the fuel supplies. But if we can dig a little deeper into those scenarios where you start to get concerned, and I know that this isn't a new focus. You've seen some evidence on the system of this for several years, but this concern associated with adequate fuel supplies is becoming a little bit more acute.
Yeah, so we really started to identify this fuel concern in the polar vortexes that occurred in 2013 and 2014, as well as the winter of 2016-2017. What it really boils down to is the ability of the units to be able to resupply that liquid storage in times of need. So when it gets cold and those units switch to the liquid fuels, that puts a lot of pressure on the liquid fuels inventory and systems to be able to resupply those units. So the longer the duration for the units to burn oil, the more pressure there is to be able to keep them supplied. And as we retired units that didn't rely on oil to meet those needs, in particular, some retirements of coal units upstate, as well as retirements of nuclear units downstate, both of which would provide electric energy, especially during these cold snaps, and not use the oil. So their retirements put more pressure on the liquid fuel delivery system in these cold weather periods.
One takeaway is that the state and the federal public policies of transitioning to a decarbonized system to address climate change are working.
Yes.
One of the other takeaways is we've got to account for this growing demand associated with electric heat. So When you do an assessment like this, what are some of those data points that you see? Obviously, people are installing heat pumps. The CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, is working and forcing change in the marketplace. What is it that you're seeing when you put together these winter assessments?
The implementation of the public policy from an electrification perspective manifests itself in our capacity assessment is what we are forecasting from a peak load demand perspective. So right now, we're seeing the load over last year has actually dipped a little bit. That's primarily due to economic activity. But as we look out into the future, we see significant increases in winter demands as a result of the projected electrification. So much so that in the early 2030s, we're expecting winter demand that exceeds the summer demand, which would be a change for New York, who's primarily been summer peaking for a number of years.
This is a big change that we've been talking about as an organization for a while now, switching from a summer peaking system to a winter peaking system. And when we look at the future projected demand, if we didn't have that electrification of the housing and the transportation sector, we'd actually see declining winter demand over time. But when we layer that on, we have to build a system to accommodate for that changeover. So Aaron, we talked about the declining reserve margins, but actually we're seeing additions on the system, but it comes mostly with behind-the-meter solar, which you folks are accounting for in real time in the control room. You know how much is there and how much you can back down some of those fossil resources. Talk us through how you do that, especially in winter. It's a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, so a number of years ago, we took on an initiative to start forecasting the behind-the-meter solar resources. We contract with a vendor who provides us a daily estimate of what the production will be from all those behind-the-meter resources, because it is really a forecasting challenge. But what they provide, we're able to use to augment our demand forecast so that we can commit the most efficient set of resources. So we're actually counting on that behind-the-meter solar resource showing up to the level that the forecast vendor is providing, and then we commit additional resources or decommit resources to meet the demand at the lowest cost. In the winter, the peak demand is typically in the evening after the sun is set, so those solar resources don't provide a lot of reliability value at the time of peak. But any power production that either the behind-the-meter solar or the front-of-the-meter solar resources provide when the sun is up actually offsets the need to burn fossil fuels, stored fuels that may have limited inventory, especially during these cold snaps, as we've talked about. So there is benefit to them, to the market systems, take as much advantage of that to meet the demand using the least cost resources.
And of course, the future design is that this is where storage can come in overnight.
Correct. So the ability of a storage device to actually capture that production when it's available and shift its availability to times when the electric system needs it is really the key value and benefit of the storage resources.
But in highlighting the complexity going forward with the demand forecast, with behind-the-meter solar or front-of-the-meter solar and the additional storage capacity capability, that's also going to be a bit of a challenge in forecasting for the day ahead.
Correct, because those storage devices that we expect to get built have limited duration. So they can store whatever amount of energy they're designed to, but it is likely not going to be a 24-hour resource. And at some point, you need the energy on the system to recharge those storage devices so they're available for the next time of need. So as we look at more and more intermittents coming into the system, being able to forecast their availability so we can time the charging of the storage appropriately to make sure that we continue to meet reliability needs is going to be an additional challenge.
Timing is everything in this case, and what we call round trip is you're going to have to do some heavy calculations. And accounting also for those really cold temperatures and battery performance is going to be another kind of curveball.
Correct. The efficiency of those storage resources changes with temperature. We'll have to forecast that. The additional resource type that we haven't talked a lot about is wind. So in the winter, the wind patterns are stronger, so to get more energy out of the wind resources, we have systems that can forecast their availability and provide situational awareness to the operators. But the going forward challenge is going to be coordinating when the wind is available, when the sun is available, when to charge the storage resources, when is the true demand for electricity, and trying to move all those pieces around to make sure that we always have enough supply to meet the demand when it shows up.
Aligning the amount of resources with the operations and dispatch of those resources with the weather and timing it day to night.
Correct. And then having the capability to respond to unexpected events like we do today. So sudden unavailability of a transmission line, of a generator, or if the forecast is wrong for solar production or wind production, and how to manage all those variables through time.
So when we contemplate switching from a summer peaking system to a winter peaking system, what are those elements that you folks are focused on in the operating the grid?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the primary concerns, and we've covered it a bit here, is the resource mix that's going to be available to serve that increased winter load. With the fuel infrastructure that's in place, there are concerns of meeting that increased winter demand, especially when you factor in the unavailability of natural gas, which primarily occurs in the winter. When you think of a summer demand, which can be quite a bit higher today than the winter demand, the natural gas system has headroom to be able to run gas-only generators to serve that. As we transition to a winter peaking system, the concern and focus is really what is the resource mix that we need to build and have in place to be able to serve that winter demand.
In other words, we need more capacity. We need more resources on the system. The cooling demand is pretty much built into the system during summer now. But the winter paradigm is something brand new. It's a new frontier going forward.
Correct.
So back to winter for a second. If we do start to see declining reserves in the moment, what are some of the tools? If we do have an event that looks something like Winter Storm Elliott, what is it that you have on hand in terms of tools and communications? Take us into the control room, if you will. Give folks an idea of some of the steps you would take. And if we get a little heads up on the weather before it happens, what are you doing to prepare for that event?
As we enter any season, we're really looking out 5 and 7 days in the future. What is the weather? What conditions are going to exist? What is the forecasted demand? And how are we going to serve that demand? So when we head into a period of higher demand, typically a number of maintenance outages scheduled, not only on the transmission system, but on the generators, so that they can be prepared. The first thing we'll do is request those facilities that are out for maintenance be returned to service. We also start communication with the fuel suppliers, the natural gas system, the suppliers of oil inventory in the state to make sure they're ready and we have good situational awareness as to their capabilities to serve electric generators.
This is what we would refer to as gas-electric coordination, making sure that those two commodities are prepared to address that event.
Correct. The other thing we do as part of a recurring process is we actually survey the generators in New York to understand their fuel situation. Do they have firm gas contracts? Do they have on-site storage capability? How much liquid storage do they have on site? What are their plans for replenishment over the near term? That all factors into our operational readiness plan as we go in to have good situational awareness of the resources that will be available to us to serve these needs.
Aaron, is this an area that's becoming more challenging in recent years?
Yes, definitely with the push to convert oil heating to natural gas. That's put additional load on the gas system or demand on the gas system, which again translates into less gas being available for power gen. Also, as the demand over the longer term for oil in the state for heating has declined, that means some of that infrastructure to serve that oil demand has also been retired. In these times where we're heavily reliant on the oil infrastructure and that resupply chain, that again puts additional stress on that because the headroom isn't as great on that system anymore either.
So there's several different communications protocols the operators have in real time with various different state agencies. We talked about the reliability organizations. Walk us through some of those things too. As
we approach closer to real time, we run our day ahead market, so that runs every day. And that's the basis for the commitment of generation that we need to serve the demand. From there, the operators really scrutinize that commitment for the next day, looking at what units were committed, what is the demand, any near-term changes to what the load forecast is going to be based on updated weather conditions, any additional changes to supply based on information that comes into the control room on generator availability. But we also communicate with our neighboring electric organizations and really take an assessment of their conditions as well. Because New York is part of the interconnected electric system, we can buy and sell electricity with our neighbors. That basically expands the pool of resources that are available to us to serve demand. But before we count on that, we want to have a full understanding of what are the conditions in the neighboring regions. That coordination really goes on continuously between the control room at the NYISO and the neighboring control areas, and there's always refinements to the plan as we approach real time.
On the other side of that equation, you want to know what our neighboring RTOs and ISOs capacity profile is, because if they're in need and we're in a position to help, they're going to call on us for that. I think not everybody understands or realizes that the grid is so interconnected.
It's very interconnected, and there's a large benefit that we in New York get from being interconnected because we can lean on the neighbors if they have capability available in times of need, and we can also help support them in their times of need if we've got excess capability.
So especially in emergency operating protocols, if they look like they're moving towards a position where they are going to be in need and we need to help, or vice versa.
Correct. And then in addition, there's a number of emergency actions that the operators can take. In that category of procedures, we have the ability to call on consumers to reduce demand. So we typically call that voluntary curtailment. So if that were to occur, you'd see on your local news or maybe from your local utility a request to conserve energy in certain times if you're able to. The other thing we can do is request emergency energy purchases from neighboring areas. Again, if they've got the capability to support us, we can actually request and buy energy into New York in an emergency fashion to help support the load in New York. The other thing we can do is there's a concept of reserve on the electric system. So typically we procure enough generation capacity to serve the demand plus some headroom or reserve so that we're always able and ready to respond to contingency events or unexpected forced outages of generators. So typically we try to procure enough reserve to be able to replace two of the largest generators. But in times of need, we can actually reduce that amount of energy that we're holding as reserve, convert it to energy to serve demand. And then the last step, or the ultimate step, would actually be to start disconnecting customers in order to keep the system whole and maintain the overall electric system.
Imagine that one of those protocols, the emergency purchases, is becoming more complex too in real time, because not only are we seeing reliability margins declining and the amount of capacity narrowing a bit, but that's a dynamic that's happening with our neighbors and across the country. Yes?
Correct, yes. As the fleet and the grid transitions, we are seeing those narrowing margins, across the industry. And so in times of need, especially if the cold snap or the weather phenomenon that's driving the need in New York is broader than just New York, that can put stress on the regional power grid and even the regional gas supply or oil supply. So really the coordination that we spoke to is really increasing in importance so that we can really fully understand what the region looks like, not only New York, to make sure we can be ready to serve demand.
And what you just described is what played out in Winter Storm Elliott, as that weather moved west to east and started to impact the system to our south and west, and eventually arrived in New York here. That was something that's hard to plan for because it also happened with such speed.
Yes. One of the things that we're seeing is the rate of change, it seems to be increasing, where you go from things are normal, things are working well, to things start to fail, and we saw that during Winter Storm Elliott. As that weather moved from west to east and there was issues with generators being able to continue to run, some of them had freezing issues. There was also reduction in the amount of gas available because the wellheads froze or the pipeline infrastructure had issues with that cold weather. So there was a fairly rapid transition of how those two things then impacted the electric system, and the operators, through the coordination protocols that we have in place and train on, were able to respond to that. The other key aspect from a New York perspective was the ability of those dual fuel generators to switch to oil in short notice. So when the natural gas became unavailable, the generating units in New York were able to switch to that liquid fuel, continue to supply the needs of New Yorkers, and were actually allowed us to assist some of the neighbors.
All right, well, let's shift just a little bit. I think it's important and helpful to review those situations again and then what we have in place to make sure the grid stays reliable in those situations. But remind folks that your assessment does show that we're ready to go into this winter. You're confident of that. I think it's probably helpful to maybe end on this note, but if you can walk through with us the greater collaboration we have here at this ISO with the planning department.
The tools that the operators have to manage these events don't appear immediately. So there's a lot of coordination and planning that needs to go in place to make sure that when we actually get to real-time operation, the tools are available to serve the needs. As you mentioned, Kevin, the planning department has a number of assessments that they look out into the future, trying to assess what the system is going to look like under those scenarios, and are there needs that we can identify now so that the market can respond to those to provide the resources we need.
Well, incredibly interesting, complex, and important. Thanks for taking us through all of these different tools, elements, and ideas. And kudos to you and the operators for getting us through these tough situations. And we appreciate you coming by the podcast, and we'd love to have you back in the future.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.